Carissimi amici, sono Pedro Morago e oggi abbiamo il privilegio di avere con noi la dottoressa Diane Zuckerman. Diane Zuckerman è la Presidente del National Center for Health Research in Washington. Ha un ampio curriculum come professoressa nelle più prestigiose università americane e anche ha avuto un ruolo molto importante nel processo di autorizzazione dei vaccini COVID-19. È per quello che l'abbiamo oggi con noi. Hello, I'm Pedro Morago, University Lecturer in Research Methods and Evidence-Based Practice at Teesside University. It is a special honor to have today with us Dr. Diane Zuckerman, President of the National Center for Health Research. Dr. Zuckerman, thanks so much for accepting our invitation and welcome.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Zuckerman is a well-known figure for the American public. In addition to her role at NCHR, she's a previous faculty member and researcher at Vassar, Yale, and Harvard, and a fellow in bioethics at University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Zuckerman has also worked with the US Department of Health and Human Services, the Congress of the United States, and the White House. Dr. Zuckerman has also regularly appeared before FDA advisory committees to testify as a medical expert on the safety and effectiveness of medical products. And for all these reasons, we have invited her to talk about the COVID-19 vaccines, in particular about their process of emergency use authorization before the FDA. Dr. Zuckerman, if I'm not wrong, the first meeting relating to the procedures, to the approval procedures of COVID-19 vaccines was held on October the 22nd. But before getting to that, I would like to take a look at what was the climate, the landscape over the previous 4 or 5 months within the American society. What was your perception about possible tension, pressure? Could you tell us about that?
Well, there was certainly a lot of pressure coming from the White House. We were very well aware that President Trump was repeatedly saying he wanted these vaccines to be out before the election. He thought that would be helpful to him, for him to be reelected, and that made everyone very nervous. The FDA had put out what they call a guidance. This is a written document. It is guidance. It's not a requirement, but it tells companies what they expect. And the first thing that the FDA did was put out a guidance for approval of a vaccine. And their guidance for an approval said at least 1 to 2 years of data following up on patients who've been vaccinated, as well as the patients in the control group. So they had a very clear, very well-defined description of what the study should look like. It should be what's called a double-blind clinical trial. That means that the patient doesn't know if they are getting the vaccine or a placebo, and the person administering it, or at least the person studying it, also doesn't know. And half the people were going to get the vaccine and half were going to get a placebo. And that was going to be random. And then they would be followed up for at least a year, if not 2 years, is what the FDA stated they wanted. And they also said they wanted about 30,000 people in the study. So half would be vaccinated and half would be placebo. And then a couple of months later, the FDA came out with a different guidance. And the new guidance was not for FDA approval. It was for what's called emergency use authorization, which is specific to a pandemic type of situation where the FDA lowers their standards and says, temporarily, we will be willing to have you put this product on the market. It won't be approved, but it can be sold and it can be given to a lot of people. But we, the FDA, can withdraw it at any time. This is temporary. So the idea behind it is that companies would have the incentive to keep studying their product, even if it was authorized, because they want to be able to sell it for as long as they want to be able to sell it, and they don't want a temporary arrangement. The guidance for the emergency use authorization was much lower. The studies were the same number of people, same design, but instead of at least a year or two, they would be followed for a median of at least 2 months. And a median means that half the people would have had the vaccine or the placebo at least 2 months, more than 2 months, and that half would have less. So basically, you had about half the patients who were only followed for about a month after their last dosage, 2 weeks after their last dosage. So that's how it works, that since the vaccines don't work until about 2 weeks after, they would need to be followed for approximately a month or two, in some cases 3, but not too many people had it that long. And that is a much lower standard, obviously. For safety, I think not so important, because most adverse events, what they're called, most complications happen right away. Either people have an allergic reaction, which is right away, or they have certain side effects like terrible headaches or body pain or other things. Usually it happens within a few days, or at least a few weeks, or at least a few months. But what is more worrisome is not knowing how long the vaccine lasts. So if you've only studied it for a month or two, or at most 3, and you don't have that many people who were exposed to the virus, that's the other problem with these clinical trials. They had 30 or 40,000 people, a lot of people, but they only had 200 or less, 200 people in each study, in each of the first 2 studies that ended up being diagnosed with COVID. So that means that you're not basing what happened, how effective the vaccine is, on 30,000 people. You're really only basing it on 200 people, only 100 of, perhaps only 100 or more of whom have gotten the vaccine, or less in this case.
That's true. And Dr. Zuckerman, those rules, those initial rules were set, as we said, in the meeting of October the 22nd, 2020, the famous rule of the 2 months, the 2 months follow-up. I read with much attention an article you published very few days thereafter. I think it was on the 26th of October on the British Medical Journal, talking a little bit about that meeting. And from what I've seen, from what I've read, we could do a whole program around that meeting. I think that there were some issues with the minutes as well. Is that correct?
Yes, well, you have to keep in mind that so these public meetings are for what the FDA calls advisory committees. These are outsiders. These are not people who work for the government for the most part. They're doctors, and usually there's a patient representative and a consumer representative, but it's usually about a dozen people. And, you know, the FDA gets to choose them. So if they want approval, you know, if they want a product to get on the market, in this case authorization, not approval, then they pick the people who are most likely to say yes. So starting in October, there was this meeting talking about, are these standards, these are the standards, what do you think? And there wasn't a lot of concern, but there was some concerns expressed about how short-term it was, and is this really going to be enough information, and things like that. And the FDA officials at the meeting are actually supposed to be quiet at these meetings. This is supposed to be outside advisors asking questions from their perspective and raising concerns from their perspective. But these meetings don't always go that way. And these were examples, these meetings where the FDA did not stay in the background the way they're supposed to. They expressed their view and they pushed things in a particular direction.
Okay, so that was exactly the sense of the article and in the British Medical Journal. Thank you very much, Dr. Zuckerman. Then in the same article, you raised some concerns in basically agreeing to what Professor Doshi had said a few days before about the methodological limitations of the trials, or at least of the protocols. In addition to the 2-month follow-up, Professor Doshi had highlighted some serious issues with the sample, basically with some categories, some population categories being either non-represented or underrepresented. So could you tell us a bit about that, about basically the level of representativeness of the sample in the trials?
Well, one of the biggest issues and one of my greatest concerns was everybody knew that the oldest people were most likely to die from COVID. These were the people who wanted the vaccine the most. But we know from flu vaccines and other studies that a lot of times older people, their immune system is not as good, and that even a vaccine is not that effective. So with flu vaccines in the United States, a lot of times, actually, I think every time, the vaccines are less effective for people over 50 or over 60. And in this situation, not only were we particularly concerned about older people, but we also were very concerned about people in nursing homes in the United States. That was a huge issue where a lot of spread of the virus and a lot of hospitalizations and deaths were very vulnerable older people. And we had no data on them at all. Nobody in a nursing home were in any of the studies. They did have a few people in their 70s, but not very many, for example, and none of them were these frail, more frail elderly people who would be in nursing homes. So we had the two problems with that. Number one, we didn't know how effective the vaccine would be for them. And number two, we didn't know how they were going to react if they had a bad reaction to the vaccine. And maybe it would be scary or frightening. And maybe the vaccine would do more harm than good for those elderly people. There were other things that were of concern, but that was the greatest concern for me. Were there other diversity? I mean, there were not that many people of color who were actually sick. So that was the other thing. When you have, 30 or 40,000 people, and a good percentage of them were over 60, and a good percentage of them were not white, that's, what you want. But when you only have 200 people who are then diagnosed with COVID, you end up with 2 people who aren't white, or some very small number, and not very many people who are older. So so on the one hand, it's good news because they're not getting sick, but on the other hand, maybe they're not getting sick because they're staying at home and not going anywhere. So it may not be that the vaccine's so great. It may be that these very vulnerable people, who in the United States are people of color and older people and people with other kinds of serious illnesses, they're staying home. And so we don't know how well the vaccine's going to work for them because they're smart enough to not be exposed. So those are some of the issues. Are there other ones that you would like me to talk about?
Oh, yes, please. I think if we put together the sample size and the short follow-up, we get to the point of the statistical power of the studies. And to me, one of the strongest points of Professor Dosh's article was that he was highlighting what Talthax, if I'm not wrong, was the Moderna's chief medical officer. Talthax himself acknowledged that Moderna's studies was lacking statistical power because of these issues. Because on the one hand, the sample was not big enough, and on the other hand, secondly, the duration, the follow-up time was not long enough. So he was, I think, quite candidly admitting that their study was lacking that statistical power, but because some kind of urgency, they will have to do something.
Yes. I mean, one of the other things that Peter Doshi raised was how COVID was defined, how the cases were defined. So anybody who was asymptomatic, who had no symptoms, they were not considered to have gotten sick. And even the ones that were considered very sick, one of Dr. Doshi's concerns and mine as well, was that their definition of very sick didn't seem that sick. They weren't necessarily hospitalized. They might have some symptoms that were not good, but they weren't necessarily serious, and yet they were being defined that way. And so they were coming out with conclusions like nobody who was vaccinated got seriously ill. That would be one conclusion, without telling you that only 5 people in the placebo group got seriously ill. So that's a statistical power issue. If you've got 0 in one group and 5 in the other, that's not statistically significantly different. And that's, so that's the problem when you've got not that many people who are diagnosed with COVID, and you're specifically looking at the very sick ones, because that sounds dramatic, right? That's what people want. They want to know they're not going to get very sick. And they're being told, don't worry, if you get vaccinated, you won't get very sick. And you couldn't really draw those conclusions from those studies because of the statistical power issue and the very small number of people who were categorized as very sick in categories that many of us thought were too loose. Almost no deaths, almost no hospitalizations. You feel ghoulish complaining that not enough people got very sick. But if you want to know if a vaccine works, it's helpful to have differences between the placebo group and the vaccinated group.
That's very true, Dr. Zuckerman. That was the point very, very clearly presented by Professor Doshi about the end point, which was the end point that was really, really being observed in those trials. And it was clear that the end point was a very primary one, was basically mild cases or mild symptoms with a PCR positive test, clearly. So that was I think was an argument which has become very, very, very influential within the public opinion. Right. So after that, after the October meeting, as you have very rightly clarified, was the FDA advisory committee. So after that, we got the announcement in November about the availability of the results from the Pfizer trial. Then we've got the application done by Pfizer, I think it was on the 20th of November. And then we've got the meetings on the December the 10th, a new meeting of FDA's advisory committee, in this case, to actually discuss Pfizer's application. Is that correct? And I think I would like to mention something. I read in the news that some of the members of who had raised some objections in the previous meeting were not invited to the, is that correct? Were not invited to the December meeting?
Well, we don't know if they weren't invited or they weren't available or they decided they didn't want to go. We only know they weren't there.
They were there. Okay. So, and in this meeting, so basically the thing we have read, we have had the pleasure to read your testimony, so the notes. So can I ask you, Dr. Zuckerman, were you physically there, or you just sent the testimony in writing, or were you present in the actual committee?
Well, nobody was present in the actual committee. It was all a Zoom, it was all remote. But I was there and I did speak. They couldn't see me, but I did have PowerPoint slides, so they could see my slides and they could hear my voice, and I was speaking at the time, but they could not see my face. So it is a little less powerful, I think, when you're doing it that way, because you're not an actual human being. You're just this disembodied voice. But I was participating as much as anybody could. The advisory committee members also were usually not seen. So generally, we could hear they were introduced, but then you were hearing their voices, but you weren't seeing them talking. So the whole meeting was, not as good as a regular Zoom meeting would be, actually.
Good. So I can confirm to our listeners that Dr. Zuckerman in that meeting raised the points that she has already explained in depth. So fundamentally, the issue 2-month median follow-up, which, as Dr. Zuckerman has explained, was too short. And another point which I think is still worth emphasizing. You said that it was, at that point, absolutely essential that the randomized control, so the double-blind randomized control, to be continued. So that, can you tell us a bit more about that? Why was so important not to lose the randomization and blinding factor?
Yes, so there are two issues here, and I emphasized it in my remarks, but the FDA had also actually invited a expert speaker from Stanford University who also talked about the same issue. So it's not like the FDA wasn't aware of this. So 2 reasons. Number one, as we said, you want to know how long a vaccine lasts. You don't want to get vaccinated if it's only going to last a month. You don't want to bother, and you don't want to take the risks of a vaccine if it's only going to last a month or even 2 months. So you want to know how long it's going to last. And once you lose that randomization, because the companies were already promising the people in their studies, thank you for participating in our study. Don't worry, if you're in a placebo group, you will be among the first people to get the vaccine if the FDA approves it. But of course, the FDA didn't approve it. They authorized it. So the companies didn't have to immediately vaccinate their placebo group. And they didn't have to encourage. I mean, that's the other thing. What the companies did was they reached out to their study participants and said, if you want to know if you're in the placebo group, just ask us, we'll tell you. And if you're in the placebo group and want to be vaccinated, just ask us and we'll do it. So it was not just allowing the placebo group to be vaccinated, it was encouraging them to. And not only does that mean we lose all that information about how long this vaccine lasts, but it also makes it impossible to gather the 1-year data for an FDA approval. So that was the big issue. And I was so sure, I have to say, I was so sure that the advisory committee would agree that this was not acceptable. We need longer term data. And there certainly were people on the advisory committee who did agree with me and with this professor from Stanford, but not everyone. And this is actually something that happens quite often with advisory committees, that there are certain kinds of people on FDA advisory committees that just want, whether it's a vaccine or medication, they just want it out there. They want it available as soon as possible. You could think of that as caring a great deal about patients, but I don't see it that way. I see it as not caring about science, not caring about getting the information we need to protect everyone. But that was the problem at the first meeting. It was the problem at the second meeting, the first meeting being Pfizer, the second meeting being Moderna, and it was a problem at the third meeting, which is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And the only difference was that at the first meeting, the FDA seemed a little bit more insistent that we need these long-term data. And by the second meeting, FDA officials were saying, well, it would be good to have it, but I guess it's not possible. And by the third meeting, it was, clear that it was not going to happen.
I can see that the points you raised in your testimony are very clearly presented, very powerful. That was, so I make sure that we share those documents with our public. And that was, as we have said, that was the 10th of December. But only the following day, on the 11th of December, there was a very, so the Washington Post, if I'm not wrong, the Washington Post published in the morning a very clear message to Dr. Stephen Hahn, or a message from the President of the United States addressed to Stephen Hahn, who was at that point the commissioner of the FDA agency, in terms of, can I say, some kind of urgency or some kind of, can we say, pressure?
Well, sure. I mean, the thing that, let me say, I've never seen ever is that, this advisory committee meeting was held one day and the vaccine was authorized the next day. I'm not even sure it was 24 hours. FDA always takes months to make these decisions. They never make them immediately like that, which, to some extent felt like they had already made the decision. And the question was, had they made the decision, and was it because of political pressure from the White House, although the election was already over, so it wasn't going to change that result. But the other thing I think is that there was tremendous pressure everywhere. It wasn't just coming from the White House. It was coming from public health people. A lot in the United States. I imagine this is probably true in other countries also. A lot of times the so-called medical experts really don't understand about statistics or regulation of products. To, many medical experts just see it as annoying instead of life-saving. And so I think there was just tremendous pressure everywhere to get these vaccines on the market. And even more than that, tremendous pressure not to say anything negative, not to be an anti-vaxxer, not to be one of those people who thinks vaccines are bad. And all of us who were criticizing the studies were in a risky situation because we didn't want to be considered against vaccinations. I say this as someone, I got vaccinated with one of the vaccines as soon as I could, but I will say I didn't want to get vaccinated right away. I mean, I wasn't eligible anyhow, and I couldn't have, but I did not want to get vaccinated 3 days after it was authorized. I wanted to wait and see how things were working. And, and in the real world, they were working pretty well with these vaccines. But what I'm saying is huge amount of pressure from the public health community and from the medical community and from all politicians, not just the White House, to get a vaccine out there, encourage people to get vaccinated so that we could all go back, to normal life.
Dr. Zuckerman, you have already mentioned the two meetings after the first one with Pfizer. Then on the 17th of December was the meeting to discuss Moderna's application. And in February, the 26th, you had the meeting, the advisory committee meeting to discuss Johnson & Johnson vaccine. I can say to our listeners that Dr. Zuckerman raised or presented her testimony in both meetings as well, and the points were very similar. So basically, most of the points were very similar to those issues with Pfizer. I would like to, because we are, I think, getting close to an end, I would like to finish with some remarks from Professor Doshi in the meeting, in the Johnson's meeting on the 26th of February. So Professor Doshi literally said, "I'm nervous about the prospect of there never being a COVID vaccine that meets the FDA's approval standard. The agency has already authorized 2 COVID vaccines as meeting the EUA standard of may be effective. Granting another EUA to Johnson will begin to create a kind of marketplace of vaccines good enough to be authorized but never approved."
Well, I agree. That's a big risk. And actually, I think the only way that FDA can approve them is by lowering their standards for approval. They're certainly not going to have a year of randomized data. And I recently wrote a guest editorial for the American Journal of Public Health, which points out that there were very few emergency use authorizations before this pandemic. And they were for things like Ebola and Zika and other things that weren't a big risk in the United States. But if you look at the history of how these emergency use authorizations are used, they very rarely end up with an FDA approval. Occasionally they do, but very often they don't. And I think it's for a lot of reasons, but one of them is once it's out there, and certainly once it's used by millions of people, it becomes impossible to do a study. So we can look at all of us that were vaccinated and we can say, well, not too many people hospitalized. That's great. Not too many of us died. That's great. But it won't really tell us how good the vaccine is unless there's something to compare it to. And if all we have, for example, are the people who refuse to get vaccinated in the real world, and we have a lot of those in the United States, but those people are different in other ways too. They tend to be less educated. They're not wearing masks. They're not following social distancing. It's very often the same people who don't take the virus seriously. And so if they get sick and those who are vaccinated don't, it won't only be because of the vaccine. It may be because their behaviors are different.
Dr. Zuckerman, I would like to end our interview with another quote from Professor Doshi. I have cited him so many times. I wish he will not get too upset with me for that. One of the most popular quotes from Doshi, the Italian public, is his response to a statement from professors, I think it's Professor Walensky, Walk, and Fauci, who I think was in February, in an article in February, they stated that clinical trials have shown that the vaccines authorized for use in the United States are highly effective against COVID-19 infection, severe illness, and death. Peter Doshi, on the 2nd of March, on the Journal of the American Medical Association, published his inaccurate statement article, saying that remarks from Professors Walensky, Walk, and Fauci were inaccurate and inconsistent with the data. So in our programs, we have presented this statement as the conclusion, so as a kind of probably useful information for people when they are presented with these too assertive statements. Probably the right answer is something like that. So those kind of assertions or statements are inaccurate and simply inconsistent with the data available. Dr. Zuckerman, thank you very much. You have made a fantastic, a very valuable contribution to informing the Italian public. And I can promise you that from today in Italy, you will be as popular as Professor Doshi.
Oh, well, thank you. I do want to add one thing if there's time, and that is just that I think the data were not good enough. And I agree with Peter Doshi that some of these statements were premature. The good news is that in the real world, where we're seeing what's happening now, we are seeing that vaccinated people are not getting hospitalized and are almost, never getting hospitalized and almost never dying. So we may end up finding that these vaccines are very good. But the problem is, how do we get to that knowledge? And shouldn't we have that knowledge before millions of people get vaccinated?
Dr. Zuckerman, thank you very much, and we hope to have you with us very soon again.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Glad to be there.